Kia ora, I'm Nadine Higgins and this is day 2 of Vision Week. And today we're focusing on connecting New Zealand, our transport systems, technology and the tourism that our economy has been so reliant on. We're joining you again from the Royal New Zealand Yacht Squadron, where we'll be defending the America's Cup next March, an event where tourism, transport and technology place Auckland Harbour centre stage. It will bring the nation together, and that is what Vision Week is all about. We're a not-for-profit summit to get New Zealanders talking about a shared vision for our well-being. Vision Week isn't affiliated to any one business, government entity or political party, and the ideas that we gather will be made available to all Kiwis. And importantly, we want to hear from you. So please share your vision for New Zealand in no more than 30 seconds and email us content@visionweek.co.nz, or you can post online using the hashtag VisionWeekNZ. The best ideas will be included in this week's programs. Today, the first of our expert panel debates gets underway at 11, and we'll answer your questions during a live interactive Q&A session to follow at 11:30. First up though, with many borders still closed to international travel, countries like New Zealand and Australia face the very real prospect of isolation that could last years rather than months. Greg Ward discussed what this means for us with one of New Zealand's leading social scientists, distinguished Professor Paul Spoonley.
Maybe we could start off by asking you first, when do you expect to be able to take an overseas holiday?
Not anytime soon. I think that we're fooling ourselves if we think that mobility, particularly international mobility, is going to ease anytime soon. I think this is much, much more impactful on what we can do internationally than most people realise.
In fact, you're warning us to be ready in case it takes 2 to 4 years before migrants and tourists return. So with that sort of wait, what does that sort of isolation do to a country?
Well, what it does is it begins to put a focus on the things that are important to us locally. So there's a great deal more emphasis on localism, on what we can do as tourists inside our own country, how our systems are going to operate. But we are a trading country and we trade on various things. I mean, I don't think people realise quite how extensive our international links are, and in particular the way in which tourists, international students, temporary workers, permanent migrants influence this country that is New Zealand in the 21st century. At the point of lockdown, there were 310,000 people in this country on temporary work and study visas and some permanent visas. So that's an extraordinarily large group of people who are here working and studying in this country. And that doesn't even begin to account for the number of tourists who come here.
There has been a lot of talk about appreciating what we have and enjoying what New Zealand is during the reset. But is there a danger this could be overstated? Because when you're worried about your job, you're worried about health, you're worried about your family, it's not the best time to appreciate scenery in the South Island.
No, it's not. And I think we should acknowledge that some of us are much more privileged than others, that when we're talking about a pandemic, we need to acknowledge that that will exacerbate the inequalities that already exist in New Zealand. So as we come out of the pandemic, some of us are going to be able to travel to Queenstown and make up for the lost international tourists, but many of us won't be able to. And we need to acknowledge that there are very different New Zealands inside the country. There are people who will be the traditional impoverished, but there will be new groups who will be the unexpected impoverished as well. The people who, prior to this pandemic, had a job and had a future, and now both of them have gone. So we need to acknowledge the growing number of people who are going to be facing financial and other difficulties.
Isn't it extraordinary that some of those people are now queuing for food parcels in Queenstown?
Yes, I mean, we should acknowledge that this pandemic has impacted upon our New Zealand communities, but it's also impacted upon those people who are in New Zealand on these temporary visas. And I feel very, very strongly for them in terms of their situation because, they are stuck here. They don't fit in terms of our requirements for benefits and work support. This has accelerated some of the changes that were already occurring, but it's also impacted very significantly on some industries, such as, in this case, the tourism and travel industries. Hospitality, I would add to that as well. So whereas you might have thought, well, in a gig economy, there are going to be some workers who are going to face precarious work in the future because machines are going to take over, we've seen a pandemic add to that degree of precariousness and really introducing into our system groups of people who are facing a very different future from what they were 3 months ago. But I think it raises a fundamental question in terms of another set of issues, which is how we reskill and match people to new industries and new employers when they've lost their job. And they've got a very good skill set. So let's not overlook that skill set. Let's use it in ways that benefit all of us.
New Zealanders have been quick to take advantage of the many holiday deals aimed at promoting domestic tourism. But with our borders facing months of closure, how will the industry survive and what will it look like 5 years from now? Here's Tourism New Zealand's Chief Executive, Stephen England Hall.
We started talking about this last year, well before COVID occurred. But New Zealand's been on a journey for some time to move from volume to value to values-based marketing, and as a destination having people come here because they share the same values identity that we do. And I think that that's something that people are going to continue to want to have exposure to. But I also think that post-COVID, that desire to have a values-based experience, so how do I identify with you as a person and what you stand for, and how does that change how I see the world? And I do think New Zealand has a really unique opportunity ahead of itself with regards to that.
Now, we saw supply chains compromised during the lockdown, and they continue to be compromised. How will that impact on tourism?
Well, the big impact that obviously we've seen is our borders are closed. So from a supply chain perspective, if there is no border to cross, there aren't any visitors. And without visitor flow, we have no income. We have no revenue being generated for the economy. And one of the benefits of tourism, and many countries around the world have taken advantage of this, is every time a visitor turns up somewhere and swipes their EFTPOS card or their credit card, that's instant foreign exchange in your economy. It's growing the pie. It makes our economy bigger and healthier. But of course, with the door shut, that's not happening. So the supply of tourists is ground to a halt.
Now, you seem energised and excited already. So what motivates that? What gives you this level of enthusiasm?
Well, I mean, I think probably like perhaps stages of grief that we move through when we go through an experience like COVID. We've gone from having an industry, international industry, or a tourism industry, in fact, even domestically, delivering some $3.5 billion a month into the New Zealand economy, and it hit zero. And I think along with that, we saw the closure of some very prominent tourism businesses. Some, of course, have hibernated, i.e. they'll return when the volumes pick up. But we've also got a number of businesses who have actually unfortunately closed completely. And of course, we're starting to see a wave of redundancies and the wave of closure of businesses throughout tourism and hospitality and associated sectors. That's going to continue for quite a while. So during that first period, of course, there's quite a lot of anger and maybe a lot of frustration and sadness is what we're seeing as an entire industry crumble. But through all this, there are some green shoots. And we're starting to also see, and I'm having conversations with people about what are they going to do now. We've got domestic operating at level 2, it'll grow further at level 1. There are things like Trans-Tasman bubbles in conversation and what that could do in terms of the flow of visitors, but also not just tourism, but education and others across the border. Then I think there's the way in which New Zealand and New Zealanders have handled the COVID crisis. And I do think that gives us hope, not just in terms of tourism, but also in terms of our supply of food and beverages and how that could be utilised in the world stage. The industry is very scalable, it's very flexible, and although there will be job losses and there will be businesses that fail, there will be some that don't, and there will be new jobs created and there will be new businesses that will emerge from it. So I think this is a reset for the sector rather than a complete, disintegration.
Let's look at the jewel in the crown, Queenstown. What can the industry learn from what happened and continues to unfold in Queenstown?
I think Queenstown has a couple of different components to it. And prior to COVID-19, of course, there was this rising concern in New Zealand around the volume of tourism and tourists at certain locations, particularly hotspots like Queenstown and Rotorua to a lesser extent. But they were feeling pressure. Local communities were certainly feeling pressure. That is definitely a lack of infrastructure investment, not necessarily an oversupply of tourists, right? So I think the two things to consider on somewhere like Queenstown is how does it redesign itself coming out of COVID to say, could we set ourselves up differently? Could we have a better model for engaging with communities? Could we have a better design footprint for infrastructure services that better meet the needs of our community, but also help service our international or domestic visitor? And I do wonder if the opportunity for us is to look at somewhere like Queenstown and go, okay, the underlying natural assets that make it such a beautiful place to visit haven't disappeared. The international visitors and domestic to some extent have disappeared, and along with it a bunch of businesses would have also closed, but it will rebuild. But if it's going to rebuild, let's do it in a way that's going to, if you like, resolve for some of the issues that were there from the past. Now is a great opportunity to rethink our infrastructure design. It's a great opportunity to bring in the voice of iwi, the voice of community, as well as the voice of the industry to make sure we're designed for the future in a way that overcomes some of those challenges we were starting to see in the past. Because at the end of the day, it's not just about the visitor, it's also about us. This is our home, this is where we live. And we want to make sure that when we open our country up for others to come and join and visit, that we benefit too. It's not just about them, it's about us. And I think together we have to we have a very unique experience, and I think we have to ensure that we keep it that way by investing in what really matters to us.
Our tourism industry has of course been devastated by COVID, and with it, New Zealand's most famous natural playground, Queenstown, came to a standstill. Well, except for Queenstown's bungee jumping mayor Jim Boult, who dived into this interview with Greg Ward.
So Jim, welcome along. Now you recently displayed your resilience by jumping off a bridge in Queenstown. Paint us a picture now, if you could, of how serious the situation New Zealand now finds itself in.
We find ourselves now as a country that had as its largest foreign exchange earner tourism, really in quite a lot of trouble. Now, I mean, all industries are affected by this in some fashion, but if you take tourism, and particularly the Queenstown Lakes District, for most of New Zealand, tourism is important. For our part of the world, it simply was our economy. And it's rather like just turning the ignition key off in your car. That's it. There is no income. This is not a reduction. This is a cessation of income.
I think last year your visitor count was 70% international tourists. So while we wait for the borders to reopen, can Queenstown survive just with domestic tourism?
We can survive. We're certainly not going to thrive. Domestic tourism is never as lucrative, if I can put it that way, as the international market. But gee, we need Kiwis at the present point in time. Really encouraging aspect is the fact that 36% of our visitors to Queenstown and Wanaka last year were Kiwis. So we know they like coming here. We need them to come back in numbers. If we can get the Trans-Tasman bubble operating, with Australians coming here, we know Australians love coming to Queenstown and Wanaka, so we think we will do okay if we can get there. It'll be tough, but we'll survive.
And it sounds as though ecotourism might be one of the solutions.
The signs were being written on the wall for mass tourism over the past couple of years. And I wouldn't say we were anywhere near the issues that places like Italy and Spain were facing. But we were seeing some pushback in our community. Since the 1980s, we've been talking about value over volume. Nobody's ever really cracked the nut. Well, I think it's time that we did that. We're starting to see the development of a greater interest in culture in the district. We're interested in the iwi history in our district and how we may attract people here to share that part of our district with them.
Our government is focusing heavily on construction to kickstart the economy. Where will Queenstown fit in that?
We've put a number of projects forward for the government shovel-ready process. We're very hopeful that we will get a couple of major projects approved for that, as well as providing better infrastructure. It's also about providing jobs and economic boost for the district as well. Combined, that's about 300 million. What a great time to put that infrastructure in place when we've got lower visitor numbers, less impediment, less interruption to business.
Tech Futures Lab CEO Francis Valentine has described COVID-19 as an opportunity to return to a knowledge economy and put more humanity back into how people work. Francis, who has more than 20 years' experience in technology and education, spoke with Belinda Henley.
Francis, maybe we'll start with a question really kind of focusing on your area of expertise, which is around education and technology. We talk about sort of disruption in these sectors, but I guess never before has there been such a disruption quite like COVID-19.
Absolutely. I think when also people think of education, they often fall back into compulsory education or university education. In my world, we're educating mature adults. The average age of 47. So these are people who have realised that the knowledge they have is not going to get them into the next role they want to do, or that fundamentally they're trying to adapt into this new technological age. And so the technology we've seen almost leapfrog ahead in the last few weeks is really putting us back on track to where we should have been perhaps 2 or 3 years ago with the digitisation of systems and processes to bring us in line with other markets in the world that we trade with.
And there must be so many adults in that position at the moment. They've maybe had a career, had a job their entire lives, and now faced with a very uncertain future.
I think it's an interesting market in New Zealand because we can sell to each other, and we do have an amazing ability to have a domestic market and have small businesses. And of course, because our economy is underpinned by small business, sometimes our adaptability to new technologies and digitisation has been quite slow because we haven't had to trade and have to have a sort of an ecosystem that works and integrates with digital systems globally. But right now, I think people realise that we have to be able to move more product and services, and actually the domestic market won't enable us to grow the economy back in the way we need it to. And so the gaps are really sewing together systems that are operating globally, and that means being in the cloud, that means having system automation, it means having the ability to have really great e-commerce sites that actually integrate with logistics and manufacturers. Like there's so many pieces, so it's not about sort of piecemeal or siloed parts of digitisation. It really is the threading together of all these systems, and that's what people need to learn.
There's been so much talk about this sort of reset across so many facets of our society. Where do you think the real opportunities lie, and how important is that we act quickly?
Fundamentally, we've seen the biggest change, which is people working remotely. And while that may feel like a temporary move, and organisations are probably very keen to get everybody back in, I think what that really symbolises is the efficiency and actually some of the productivity gains that come letting people work in a different way. But to do that, you also need to understand what tools you need to make that system work, which again comes back to things like working in the cloud, having communication channels which are always on, the likes of a Slack channel, utilising video conferencing as we all have become very competent at, but also documents that can be shared. And so if you think about those digitisation to enable that, we've already gone through that transition. So coming out of this, almost everyone who could work from home has changed their behaviour. But now that's the new norm. And I think coming out of this now, we have to understand how do our businesses catch up with the human aspects of wanting change. And I'm really excited about this idea that the economy is going to increasingly thinking about society and humanity and actually equal and fairness for more people to get into roles that actually gives them a really great opportunity to contribute and feel valued in their roles, and less around minimum hourly wages and actually clocking in and clocking out.
When you mention transport agency Waka Kotahi, most New Zealanders only think about roads and public transport. But as NZTA Chief Executive Nicole Rosie told us, the agency works in collaboration with partners to be a connector for people, business and industry, including tourism. She spoke with Belinda Henley about the impact of COVID restrictions and what's important for the future.
We had over 75 infrastructure projects that were shut down at level 4 and working with our partners to put that in place, and then return to work under level 3 and 2 has been a significant partnershiping exercise. We also had renewals work being done on the road. Some of that kept going, particularly the resilience work, but that again is ramping up again, as well as managing the roads with different volumes on them. And of course, public transport continued to operate throughout the period. And we also looked at delaying WAFs and COFs, so your warrants of fitnesses and certificates of fitness and other things on the roads over the COVID-19 period to support New Zealand over that period. So significant impacts on the organisation, and of course all of our people working from home as well, which had another dimension.
And looking on from here, looking to sort of the long term or coming out the other side of this, do you think it's going to impact on your day-to-day operations?
I guess there's an internal perspective. Running Waka Kotahi, we're an organisation of 2,000 people, and all of those people have worked quite successfully from home. We very dramatically moved to have remote working using video conferencing and other capabilities. We also did the same thing with third parties. So we have actually done community engagement through lockdown using online technology. So absolutely, we've engaged in completely different ways through COVID-19, and we will take the benefits of that, and that's flexible working, being able to collaborate in different and new ways forward with us. The other big thing for us out of COVID-19 is that it's encouraged and activated government to work quite differently and collaborate much more effectively, both within government, but also across public and private sectors. And I think NZTA or Waka Kotahi was already doing that. It was already part of the way we worked, but that has been accelerated through COVID-19. And we know for sure that none of us can do these things alone, manage complex problems, manage the complexities of a transport system, even in normal times, is complex. The overlay of doing that in the COVID-19 environment and needing to make many, many decisions very fast, dynamically, required us to be highly collaborative, to work very extensively with others, and to do it in real time. We will continue to use those strengths into the future, yeah, for sure.
So you're relatively new to the construction sector. In the time that you've been in the role, what are some of the key observations that you have made?
New to the construction sector, and I'm sort of not, because I've worked extensively with the construction sector throughout my career. So my observations coming in to the sector, and already my observations having worked with the sector quite extensively in the past, is it's a very fragmented sector. Historically has been very competitive at every level in terms of how it behaves. What's been really interesting about the construction accord is, for the first time, I think we've seen the sector come together, clients, vertical, horizontal, residential, commercial, to work constructively to solve industry problems that benefit everybody across what is an actual integrated supply chain. And whilst people might be operating on different parts of the construction, vertical, horizontal, they might be in the design part or what have you, actually we're all linked together, because in the optimum model for the construction sector, you would have your horizontal infrastructure working very closely with your vertical infrastructure, your clients, etc., to produce integrated solutions for New Zealand. So we wouldn't be building a new housing development without also having thought about the water, without also having thought about the fibre, without also having thought about what public transport we need off the back of that. So I think it is a fragmented sector that it could accelerate and use the opportunity of what we've seen happen in the construction accord to really future-proof New Zealand in a much new and different way.
And as we are now able to move around our country a little bit more, I guess having those really good connections throughout the country is going to become incredibly important, especially as we all try and get out there and support domestic tourism.
And I think that's a really key point, because often people think Waka Kotahi builds roads or does, transport. What we are is we're a connector. That is our primary role. We connect New Zealand to support a thriving New Zealand. That is our sole purpose, I guess, out of COVID-19, is to continue to accelerate and improve the connections across New Zealand into the future.
So what role does technology have to play in our shared future? Who better to ask than Rocket Lab founder and chief executive, Peter Beck.
Nowhere more than Rocket Lab are you at the forefront of technology and innovation. What role do you see technology playing in the country moving forward?
I think technology has a huge role to play. If you look at the businesses that generate tremendous wealth for their countries, they're tech or deep tech based. You have a look at Silicon Valley, for example. Although we might not agree with all of the companies that have been created, there's no argument that those companies are a powerhouse for their economy. And New Zealanders are very good entrepreneurs. New Zealanders are very good at solving complex tech problems. We're less good at bringing those to the world market and commercialising them really effectively on a big scale. So I think that would be an area of opportunity that would be sad to be missed. It's almost, though, a little bit of a paradox, because right now venture capital is almost non-existent. So in the times of a crisis where you could argue that you really should be building new companies and really taking risks, there's a very limited venture capital market right now that would enable you to take those risks. But this is a speed bump. This is not a long-term set-in. So those venture capital markets will return quickly. They have capital they need to put to work. And let's just make sure that New Zealand is ready there with their arms open, ready to accept that capital in, and those ideas can get funded.
As a country, we kind of like to think that we're at the forefront of technology, but is that in fact the case?
Sometimes and sometimes not. It's funny, I used to work for a government research lab, and there's a number of things in that lab that every year, year after year, I would hear that we were world best technology, and one day I just asked the question, well, if this is so good, then, why isn't a big tech company gone and bought this whole team? Because that's what happens when technology is super good. Sometimes we think our technology is better than in fact it is, but there's equal number of times where our technology and our teams are in fact world class, if not the best in the world.
Do things like heading into space become less of a priority now we're facing such big problems here on Earth?
Well, I'd argue the opposite. Everybody's jumped on Zoom recently, and I'm not sure how many people looked at the sky while they were on Zoom thinking, oh, thank goodness for all those satellite communication networks so I can have my calls. So I think, space infrastructure is more important than ever, and having a very inward-looking, technology defeating view is exactly the wrong thing to do. I would argue that, the thing to do now is to think about those ideas, whether they're on the planet or off the planet, that have real opportunity to create value.
When the world watches major golf tournaments or New Zealand's defence of the America's Cup next March, they'll be seeing virtual eye sports animation technology developed by Ian Taylor's ARL animation team working remotely from Dunedin. But the digital highway that has made ARL a world leader isn't available to everyone.
We're all aware, actually, of the economic divide in the country, and we're seeing that as well. The poor people who are already poor are suffering the most now. But the other thing that really stood out was the digital divide. And it happened as it went into teaching kids online. Suddenly we realized that, it didn't matter how many lessons you sent out. If that electronic highway, the internet, didn't go past their house at the right speed or the right size, and some places didn't even go past their house, you couldn't teach them. So I think at the top of the list coming out of here, more than anything, is that digital divide, that electronic highway. It needs to be a real focus. We're looking for shovel-ready projects, and my fear is those shovel-ready projects might end up being roads that we put more cars on. What COVID taught us was that the most important highway we've got is the electronic one. So first of all, for our kids, to ensure that they have access to the world and all the best learning. But then for our businesses, how many businesses are sort of struggling because they weren't on that highway or didn't understand it? It has to become second nature. They have to be able to do things like we're doing, saying, oh, in 4 weeks we've got to operate remotely. Well, let's operate remotely. As the borders close, this remote highway is going to be really, really important. So it's a digital divide, not just for our young people, but it's a digital divide for a lot of our business people as well.
Longer versions of all the interviews from the Vision Week programs will be available on our website visionweek.co.nz. But now we cross to Greg Ward to introduce today's panellists. And as you've heard already, there's plenty to discuss on the theme of connecting New Zealand. During the discussion, please send in your questions for our panellists and they'll attempt to answer as many as possible live. You'll need to submit them on the Connecting NZ Q&A forum on our website, which is visionweek.co.nz/forum. Over to you, Greg.
Welcome to the first of our 3 panel debates, and joining us today are Jolie Hodson, CEO from Spark, Stephen England Hall, who is CEO of Tourism New Zealand, and Adrienne Young-Cooper, Chair of Auckland Transport and Panuku. Well, let's turn first to you, Stephen. Our borders are closed. What is the future of New Zealand tourism? Do we have one?
Well, we absolutely have a future. In the short term, we've got a couple of challenges to overcome. One, of course, is a lack of spending in the tourism ecosystem. We did go from $3.5 billion a month to zero in about 4 days. So that has undoubtedly had a pretty significant impact on the industry. So recently you would have seen the launch of our domestic campaign, which is an attempt to get the industry up and running.
I've got a bucket list of hikes that I want to do, and I think this would be a really good time to do it.
But of course it can't survive long term without the international.
Now, what's going to motivate New Zealanders to go and see their own backyard, given they're facing rising unemployment and an uncertain future?
Well, the good thing about New Zealand is it's highly accessible for a whole range of people at different levels of income and different stages of life. So New Zealand's a highly accessible place to holiday, whether it's camping or staying at a campground or staying at a motel or a hotel or visiting a beautiful urban environment like Auckland or Wellington or Queenstown or Christchurch. There's plenty of things to do for everybody.
You've been out there, you've been talking to the industry, you've been talking to your colleagues. What are you seeing and hearing from the industry in terms of the direction we need to take?
Well, it's pretty consistent feedback. In the short term, it's about survival, and the long term, it's about thriving. And in terms of thriving, there's a real focus and an emphasis on being more inclusive of community needs, ensuring the industry is more restorative of nature, and of course, more productive. So longer term, people really do have a joined up and aligned vision. But in the short term, it's very much about keeping food on the table.
Jolie, Spark is one of the country's largest digital services providers. You've seen how tourism has reacted quickly to take advantage of domestic tourism. But your own clients, you must have seen many of them have to adapt quickly. Was that impressive?
Yeah, look, we saw, particularly in those first sort of few days prior to lockdown, many businesses had to adjust how they worked, how they connected with their customers and how they thought about getting ready for the periods post that initial lockdown. So we saw a huge amount of productivity as people shifted their thinking. And I think one of the things that lockdown has provided is 7 weeks of a different way of doing things has led to behaviour change. So the opportunity for New Zealand now is to think about how do we actually lock that in for the period going forward and what are the great things we want to take forward during that time.
Well, today we have 2 important questions for all 3 of you, and I'd like to start with Adrienne. Adrienne, first off, your vision for future connectivity for New Zealand.
Well, I think one of the largest things that we're going to see over the next 10 years or so is the huge electrification of our, particularly our land transport fleet. So whether it's trains or motor vehicles, and of course the really important things such as e-bikes and e-everything. I think we'll see sort of continued investment in our roading system. We'll also see huge investment in our rail system. And I think we'll see in 10 years' time a role for rail that we can hardly envisage today. Going to the land transport system, we're going to see a lot more focus on safety. And of course, that will actually go to the vehicle fleet as well as the actual road.
Thank you. And the second of our 2 questions for all panellists, have your views on what's important changed since COVID-19?
Yes, I think that we have changed a little because we have actually seen a whole range of different behaviours, most of which I would say are really positive. One of the overriding things that I've certainly observed in many sort of areas is actually understanding, and this goes, to everyone who's in the communication, governance, political arena. New Zealanders are actually really smart. And those of us who have positions of responsibility have just kind of got to find a way to communicate with New Zealanders, because if we communicate clearly, give people great information, they will actually do the right thing.
Stephen, your vision for the future of connectivity in New Zealand?
I couldn't agree more with Adrienne. I mean, I think Kiwis are smart. We know how to solve problems. We've done that throughout our entire history, and I think that we're going to continue to do that on the back of COVID-19 as well. I mean, I'd love this idea of New Zealand becoming the first carbon zero or carbon positive destination on the planet. So what does that look like? Does that mean electrification of our aviation fleet, not just our rail? I think giving our visitors to the country, whether they be domestic or international, lots of different modal options that enable them to take a lower environmental footprint in their choices, I think is really powerful. I mean, that for me would be, from a connectivity point of view, I'd love to see that. From a digital connectivity perspective, our international visitors in particular comment that there are still large parts of their New Zealand experience where they're not on the grid. And increasingly, it's also a question of safety. So if I'm out in a remote part of New Zealand and I'm trying to have a beautiful experience and I want to be able to connect to the world, my family, my friends, but also feel safe and secure, I also want to make sure I've got connectivity too. And I know that if we think about a fully digitally connected New Zealand and one that has low carbon multimodal transport options for physical connectivity, I think that's a phenomenal place for us to live.
Do you expect anything about the culture at Spark to change if things are a little bit slower or more relaxed in the future?
What we're looking at quite closely is what is the way we want to work in the future. We know it won't be the same as where we were before, won't be the same as in COVID, but it'll be an adaptation of both those things. And I think we're taking some time to consider about what was really valuable to bring into the future. How does that work for the different teams we have? So I have retail stores, field services teams, contact centres, developers, engineers. They're all different types of working. So we've got to make sure it works for everyone. So we're just taking some time to stand back and look and learn. But there is no doubt in my mind that a lot of those tools will exist in the future, and also the flexibility. And I think one of the things we're thinking hard about also when we think about these tools into the future is the well-being of physical connection. Mental health, how do we make sure you hold on to those things as you start to think about more flexible working?
So let's hear from you now about your vision for connectivity in New Zealand.
Great connectivity did serve us well through lockdown. As we look ahead, it's really important that New Zealand has access to that leading technology, both from a skills perspective, but also great network and infrastructure. If I look ahead and I look at GDP and GDP per capita, New Zealand sits 30% below the top half of OECD countries. And when we think about that, it's been there for about 20 odd years. So now is a time, it's a catalyst for us to think about how are we going to do this differently. And for me, technology has to play a part in that. If we look at cloud adoption, for example, 20% more uptake would lead to 1 to 2% increase in our GDP, about 6 billion. 5G rollout of that network is somewhere between 6 to 8 billion per year over a 10-year period. So what we need to do is create the great infrastructure and carry on with that. We've also got to create the skills for people to be able to innovate around that technology. Just to pick up on Stephen's point too, I think as a country, we cover about 98% of population in terms of mobile coverage. We're now working with 3 mobile providers and with Crown infrastructure partners to really hone in on those areas that are either tourist spots, there's 168, there's about 1,400 kilometres of state highway, and more rural. So connectivity is more ubiquitous across the country. So it's a big focus for us as an industry.
Adrienne, you're with Auckland Transport, and during the lockdown, many New Zealanders rediscovered the joys of walking and cycling, and as a result, Auckland saw extended walkways and I think there were temporary cycleways. Will many of these changes become permanent features?
Auckland Transport is in a long-term process to roll out a lot more cycleways across the city. It's not as easy as it sounds, and everybody who's impacted in local neighbourhoods will tell you that. Over time, we will see increasing numbers of cycleways. It's very much part of the future. Right now, the reality is that we have got very significant budget constraints in Auckland. That was released on Friday, the level of financial pressure that Auckland Council, one of our major funders, is under. But on a sort of brighter note, the government is funding a package, Innovating Streets, is actually funding the rollout of transitional cycleways and other kinds of interventions in streets to make them a lot more people friendly. And we have got a number of projects in for funding. We don't know yet if they are successful. We will hopefully hear in 2 or 3 weeks. What that enabled us to do is to roll out some of these, the kinds of things that we did over COVID-19 Alert Level 4. But some of these will actually then transition to what were planned to be long-term projects. So it's doing them in a much more nimble way, faster, and then over time we'll spend much more significant amounts of money to make them permanent.
Stephen, let's look at one of the big problems you face in the future. The borders are closed and we don't know when they will reopen. When they do, are you in favour of something like a COVID-19 passport?
Yeah, look, I think having some kind of digital track and trace capability, including people coming in and out of the country, is probably going to become an essential requirement for any market that's open to international visitors. What that looks like, who knows? My preference would be that it's some kind of digital-based identity structure. Complex wording, really unnecessary, but any kind of digital platform or digital passport type capability is probably the way to go.
How crucial is the Trans-Tasman bubble when it arrives? How crucial will that be?
Well, it's very important. It's crucial to getting the industry, not just tourism, but other industries moving forward. Because obviously there's also international trade, not just people, there's actually product and sales and service trade that happens across borders that are enabled by people movement. So yes, tourists are impacted, but don't forget only half of the people who arrived in New Zealand last year offshore were tourists. The other half were visiting friends and family, business people, students, educators and so forth. And so New Zealand's currently missing out on some of that other aspect. So Australia being opened up is crucial.
Jolie, Zoom, we all learnt about it. We're all doing it. We're doing it right now. Will we embrace Zoom and other digital technologies, or will we be drawn back to more human interaction?
Look, I think it'll be a mix. I think what was really interesting to see over that time is, as you're right, people absolutely embraced it. In the past, it's probably been a bit of a trade for commitment to the meeting. I think what COVID's shown us is nothing like that at all, reality. You don't have to be in person to commit. You can do that. And I think it'll free up both from when you talk about transport, when you talk about movement of people, I think it's a great way from a productivity point of view too. But I do think we have to be careful about and more sophisticated about how we think it's used. Thinking about what is the right time for the right team to use these tools, but I can't see a world where we go back. Where we've seen the real benefit is people in remote or more regional areas in our teams. So the ability to connect through virtual versus having to physically be in an office has been hugely empowering for them, and so we're looking at how we carry those things on so they are part of that squad or team more consistently rather than being dialed in occasionally to those things.
And let's not forget about your customers, because the lockdown did expose some inequalities. There are, I think, hundreds of thousands who still don't have access to broadband. So what do we need to do to improve that?
So from a digital equity point of view, there's around about 300,000 people in New Zealand who don't currently have access to the internet. Some of that's to do with income poverty, some of it's choice. What we've had a big focus on is actually closing that gap. And part of COVID did that on a temporary basis. What we need to do is create a permanent bridge across that gap. And that's about creating propositions. So through our foundation, Skinny Jump, we provide a very low cost, as in $5, cost for those families to be able to stay connected. We also work with the government, the Ministry of Education, to get access out and tools out to families with school-aged children. I think the opportunity now is to expand that to seniors, to unemployed, to think about how we build that. So our industry is working pretty hard with government to focus on how we might do that and achieve that, because for me, as we shift to more of a digital economy, if we don't close up this inequality gap, it will just get worse, and that's not the New Zealand we want to live in, and that's not something that I'd be voting for. So it's a huge focus for our business and what we're looking to achieve over the next few years.
You mentioned 300,000 who went without. How does that compare on a global scale?
So I think if you look at that, about 1 in 3 beneficiaries are within that also. So for a developed country, it's not great. We need to be doing better.
Stephen, digital transformation, how will that impact on tourism, and what are the opportunities?
There's probably a couple of things that have been accelerated as a consequence of COVID and the use of technologies like Zoom and others. One is we've actually managed to continue our offshore trade training and development programs, and actually have managed to train many thousands of travel agents around the world on New Zealand without them having to come here. So that's been something we've been working on for a while, but it's been accelerated during the lockdown period. And we're going to continue to evolve those tools and that capability so that we can reach more people more effectively and improve productivity across the sector. In terms of tourism itself, we've seen the emergence of some new products. So you can now do a virtual bungee jump. If you haven't done that with AJ Hackett, you should definitely give it a go. You can sit on your couch at home and a guy or a girl will strap a high definition camera to their helmet and jump off the bungee for you. It's not quite the same thing as doing it yourself, but it's certainly worth a shot. And we're going to see some sort of continued innovation happening in that sort of area. And then I guess the last one is new kinds of technology being developed and deployed in tourism. Tourism is obviously a relatively low productivity sector in some areas. And part of that is because of the human, or called handrolics, the need for human being interactions to exist in order for the experience to have real value. And so that part's always going to be there, but back office capability, the deployment of cloud-based technologies for marketing, customer management, employee services, financial and accounting practices, any of those things within the system will lift productivity, which will be a real bonus. And then, of course, we've got virtual and augmented reality coming onto the scene as well. And how's that going to change the future of tourism? As of yet, it hasn't had a significant impact, but that's not to say it won't in the future.
Adrienne, do you believe the focus in the future will be more on cities where there's lots of innovation, or perhaps on more remote rural country areas where people can work remotely?
Well, I do think it lies actually everywhere. One of the really interesting things is how many parts of New Zealand until COVID-19 have been experiencing significant growth. It's not all about Auckland. There are certainly many other parts of the country, and I just spent some time over the weekend driving around Wanaka, and I'm sort of really surprised just at the scale of growth that's going on really in the middle of the South Island, admittedly a very beautiful part of the South Island, but there are hundreds and hundreds of homes and large industrial type subdivisions going in. I do think that the kinds of patterns of development that we're seeing in New Zealand, particularly some of the sprawl and the very sort of car dependent type development, I think the forces which look at more urban, more walkable, more community-focused kinds of neighbourhoods, they are actually very strong. And as we try and get ourselves to zero carbon emissions, those places will be a really, really important part of the future. I don't think any of that's changed by COVID-19. I think that one of the things that has come out of COVID-19, though, is that we do have the capacity in our urban areas to be much more connected.
What about the future of public transport? Has that changed in any way since lockdown?
We have been very thoughtful and very careful about maintaining social distancing, high levels of hygiene on the buses and trains and ferries. And we've also developed, I think in 3 days, they actually developed an app which enables passengers who are waiting for a bus or a train to see how full that particular bus or train is with respect to its social distancing, much lower density. It will take 2 or 3 months, we think, to get back to where we were pre-COVID. There will be plenty of ongoing investment in public transport. But, again, I just go back to the fact that just in the year ahead of us, we do have some quite constrained financial circumstances because of Auckland Council's financial challenges.
I did hear from one business who told me that their staff wanted to remain working from home, not because it was more convenient or they were more productive, but simply they wanted to avoid what they perceived as an added risk of using public transport.
Through our communications, we're trying to make it clear all the things that we're doing. So I've talked about social distancing. You can see on an app how full the bus is, still maintaining the social distancing. We have lots of cleaning and deep cleaning. We have contactless payment. You actually enter via the rear door of the buses, for example. So there are all kinds of methods in place to keep public transport safe. We'll continue to do that. And at this stage, we have not heard of any person in New Zealand picking up COVID-19 because of their use of public transport. So that's, I'm not saying that it could never happen. I'm just saying that is not one of the actual sources of transmission as far as we understand.
I think one of the things you can do as employers as well, which we've done, is say to people, if you're concerned about peak times, start earlier or later and pace that out through the day. So some flexibility about still coming into work if you desire to do that, but manage that through the time. And certainly we've seen that work for our people. I think as we look ahead to the future of transport, I don't think there's any doubt public transport has to be part of that future. I wonder if the opportunity is how we use more of both the networks like 5G and IoT to get smarter cities. So that helps vehicle to vehicle or big vehicles like buses to connect with traffic lights. If you think about parking, all of those things can be managed through that. So if we look ahead for that vision for New Zealand, that's what we need to see more of, I think, in terms of helping to manage congestion in these bigger cities.
So let's look at the telco industry and your relationship with transport. How would you define the relationship that you've got? Are you an enabler, a competitor? What's the relationship you've got?
I'd say we're absolutely an enabler to transport, like many industries, in terms of helping to enable the way forward in terms of the change in behaviour we want to see or the change in infrastructure. And one of the things I hope as we look ahead and the investments that are going to be made both by the government and private sector over the next while is that we take into account the digital technology that needs to be part of that, both from a sustainable carbon perspective, but also from making sure we're future-proofed to be able to use that. So if you think about construction site is another good example. We've currently got sites with cameras, sensors, so they're able to, from a safe perspective, know where restricted areas are entered. They're able to manage noise pollution. They're able to do a lot of management of trucks in and out of the sites, crane usage, all using technology and the analytics that come off the back of it. So what we're seeing is this conversion of social, mobile, analytics, cloud, all coming together to disrupt, but also create greater productivity. And that's where I think we need to focus as a country as we think ahead. What are the enablers? They're not the be-all, end-all answer. They've got to be done in conjunction with the strategy that transport has or tourism has. But it's how do we help and how do we work across the ecosystems to bring that together?
And when we make these changes and improvements, we're bracing ourselves for the odd glitch. You must have been so encouraged that you managed to get us all working and learning from home, and it was relatively smooth.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, basically we flipped within a week the country from working, learning, connecting in cities to at home. And we pretty much did that without a glitch. And that's because of the huge investment we've made, both in mobile networks, but also in the UFB that government made over time. And if we look at that, and we look ahead, that's why we want to invest in 5G, because it's a critical part of enabling technology. It's a leading technology. It will enable a lot more through the smart networks.
Steve and Jolie's ready to go with 5G as the industry had a chance to consider how it could take advantage of 5G.
I think what the industry will be looking for is what does that mean for the customer experience? What does that mean for the industry's productivity and makeup? You know, things like the integrated transport systems, telecommunication systems and physical destinations, I think is really important. Because if we can tell people, hey, this is an area that's congested or this area's got, you know, an undersupply of capacity or so forth, then actually rerouting behaviour, telling people things in real time about changing their behaviour is going to make a big impact to the industry and also communities too. I kind of look at the government currently and going, you got this $25 billion of unspent money, you know, in terms of the flow on stuff that's coming down the road to support New Zealand's recovery. And you kind of have to ask yourself the question, where are you going to invest that to create the economy you want in the future?
We have a visitor levy at the moment. How does that work and how might it be used in the future, the charge that all visitors have to pay?
One of the questions that will need to be debated, and I don't think the industry can do it in isolation, it will need to be discussed with Kiwis and also government, is it appropriate to have one? How is it set up? What's its real purpose in the future of a tourism system, which will look very different to the one we've had in the past? You know, New Zealanders have benefited for a couple of decades of growth out of tourism. And part of that is the fact that we get to go overseas ourselves on cheap holidays. And of course, the $2-3 billion of net contribution to government coffers every year from international visitation has been something the whole country has benefited from, whether it be infrastructure projects, hospitals, schools, and so forth. And I can't see that returning to the same level for quite a long time. So if there's going to be some kind of cost at the border for visitors, how are we going to make sure that's fair, how equitable, how's it going to be distributed, and how's it going to help create the future that New Zealanders want?
The industry is desperately waiting for the first visitors to arrive. How do we protect ourselves from just taking everything that does arrive? How do we protect the asset we've got so that it's sustainable and we don't experience over-tourism?
Yeah, it's an interesting debate. I mean, when you think about the number of international tourists in New Zealand on the busiest day of the year, it's probably about 165,000. There are about 5 million of us. So as a proportion of the total impact on the population, it's pretty small. Having said that, we shouldn't be ignoring the fact that that has an impact, because obviously those visitors are concentrated in certain locations at certain times, and that's something that we can't really avoid. I think in terms of when the borders do open up, not going after everything, I don't think that's actually really going to be a risk for us, given that we are still a long way away. There's going to be a very limited amount of international airline connectivity coming here. It took decades to build that connectivity in the first place. It certainly won't return overnight. And airlines who do choose to fly here will have to be done that on economic modelling. And they'll be trading off New Zealand versus Prague versus London versus New York or San Francisco or somewhere else. And so we have to get ourselves back on the international competitive agenda for most of the airlines and countries we fly to. Because, I mean, at the end of the day, it's not just our border, right? A border is just one end of a bridge. The other end of the bridge also has a gate. And so what we need to make sure that we do is that we've aligned ourselves with both ends. And even if those two borders open, an airline has to be willing to fly them. And I think we underestimate how much energy is going to be required to recreate that. And in a COVID world, post-COVID world, the costs of travel are going to go up, not down. So I think we're going to create barriers to volume just by the redesign of the total global tourism system anyway.
Costs going up, Jolie. Fortunately, the telco industry is one industry with well-paid jobs and huge potential for growth. So as we begin to wrap up this debate, how do we tap into that potential growth? What do we need to do now to really make this kickstart?
So when we think about high-tech industries, which is kind of broader than telco, I think the things that we need great infrastructure, which we're investing in, but we need the skills, the digital skills. And I guess that's a question that I have when we think about training budgets and qualifications as we look ahead that have been put out. How are we encouraging people to move into them? Because if you think about that convergence of social, analytics, mobile, cloud, all coming together to disrupt businesses, we need people understanding more of those skills and how to operate a business and innovate. That's what's disrupting the world right now. So I think from my perspective, we need to create more opportunity for those and the broader STEM skills and encouraging people into the future skills of work and bring people with us, retraining within that as well. What role can they play in a number of different sectors or businesses so we do lift both that productivity but also that ability to be employed and to be part of shaping what's going to happen for New Zealand in terms of this recovery. But it's got to be done in a context of what is the bigger picture plan for our country. And for me, there's three that I certainly think when I look at we've talked about tourism, equity is a big part, digital equity and more broadly equity. I think small business, and New Zealand's made up, there's 160 odd thousand businesses, so we have to think about that. And we have to have great investment in terms of what we're doing in infrastructure and carry on with that. So
you wanted to add to that?
I was just going to say, I think Jolie's just hit one of the big nails, if you like, on the head, which is what is the overarching plan? Because, tourism pre-COVID was 21% of export earnings, sort of 8% of GDP and so forth. And you kind of go, well, in the future, we'd like to have a very healthy, very productive, very sustainable tourism system. And we also want to grow New Zealand's economy and exports. And we want to do that which is hopefully built around two key things. One is our primary sector delivering very high value-added outcomes, i.e. we get more dollars per unit sold to New Zealanders. And the other side is how do we use STEM, science, technology, and so forth, and invest in those areas to make sure that we as a country are continually moving up the OECD rankings, but also delivering economic outcomes, well-being outcomes, and of course more equality in this country as a result. And I don't think you can solve any of those things by solving one of those problems. I think we have to come up with a much more integrated, cohesive national economic plan to help solve those things.
Adrienne, you've been listening to this. What should a high-performing transport system deliver for New Zealanders?
I think a transport system needs to actually deliver the ability for New Zealanders to make the right choice in terms of their use of the transport system, with an understanding of the impact of that on our country, on the climate, And so to do that, we've got to think in a lot more sophisticated way. We've got to give a lot more information, and certainly we have to actually make some really big changes about things like the electrification of our fleet. Our transport system has to actually drive our economy. And so it's really important that those who rely upon the transport system to conduct their businesses, to move freight, can actually do so easily, because they don't have other choices. And they're the ones who are creating the jobs and who are actually moving the goods that we all need to actually carry out, our day-to-day lives, and who help us earn our export dollars. So, transport is incredibly complex and important. There's a big plan needed. But I think there have been some great lessons out of COVID-19 that I'm sure we'll take into the future.
Jolie, a closing statement from you. I imagine yours would be focused somewhat on innovation and our ability to perform if we take risk.
I think COVID's a catalyst for change. There is no doubt, both through investment, the skills, the working across ecosystems, because I think just doing a thing in your own business, in your own silo, in your own sector will not get us where we need to go. So great connectivity will provide the opportunity to innovate upon. We need to be there to help advise as well as a country, and I think we need to work in partnership, both government and private sector, to help us deliver, to really create, I think, a fairer, modern, resilient economy as we look ahead.
And finally, Stephen, your thoughts on where we go to from here in a particularly busy sector for you?
The points that Adrienne made and Jolie have just made as well, I couldn't agree more with those. I think there's real need to connect across sector. I think there's got to be private-public collaboration. They take longer, they take a bit more energy, and they can be more frustrating, but the outcome of that can be a much, much more inclusive, more sustainable and more productive economy. And I think that's part of what we have to do here. So, I think COVID's taught us a few lessons. I think there's a few new ingrained behaviours. People will still want to come and experience what New Zealand has to offer, and I think that's just built as much on our values as it is on our place.
And we hear so much about once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to make change. Do you see that affecting tourism, or are you in there simply fighting for survival at the moment?
I think it's a two-speed solution. We have people fighting for survival right now, and their priority is effectively retaining jobs and protecting intellectual property and their brands and their supply chains and things in a very difficult environment. And we have people who are equally focused on the future and trying to make sure those businesses that do survive and the visitors who do come are contributing to a better New Zealand.
Well, Stephen, Jolie, Adrienne, thank you all very much for joining us today for the first of our panel debates.
Thank you.
Hello and welcome to our first live Q&A for Vision Week New Zealand. Joining us today on our live panel is Jolie Hodson, the CEO of Spark, Stephen England Hall, CEO Tourism New Zealand, and Adrienne Young-Cooper, the Chair of Auckland Transport. Thank you very much for joining us again. Lovely to have you with us. First of all, I want to start, this is the first day of level 1 for all of us. If you could each just tell me sort of what the impact has been on your sectors and on your businesses.
So I'm going to start, Belinda. Good morning, everyone. So if I look at our sector, we pretty much were working throughout because we were essential services. But when you think about that, there's different elements of our business that are obviously affected more. So, for example, we're starting to see more of our people come back into the offices versus working from home. If we look at our retail stores, we've had versus managed in and out and quite small numbers within stores. We're now starting to open that up, but we're still having COVID tracing app available for people. And then if I think about working with our customers in business, we've now got more people going to sites, etc. So it has increased the flexibility and freedom as we've moved towards level 1 for movement, I guess, within our teams.
And what about you, Adrienne?
Well, I guess at a personal level, the first thing is that I felt an overwhelming sense of joy and relief, and it was very nice to have that particular moment. I did feel like going and giving my neighbours a hug this morning, but I think they would have thought I was rather odd because I don't normally hug them. But actually, at a really practical level, Auckland Transport, of course, has been incredibly busy providing a whole range of services and has been very involved in a lot of construction particularly through level 4, right through to level 1 for PT services. For us, there's a huge benefit of moving to level 1, and essentially that in our public transport capacity, we've been running full services really for all through level 2, but we've been very restricted in terms of social distancing requirements. We've now got all our capacity back, and our real concerns about the operation of the whole transport system, with people essentially needing to move to cars from public transport because the buses and trains were full because of social distancing requirements, has actually not materialised. The other really important change, of course, is that, again, in our offices, we had social distancing requirements, and that meant that we could only have about half our staff at any given time in the offices. We got to about 35–40%, and that was essentially about full. Now, in fact, everyone can come back to the office. And while we will definitely retain some of the flexibility we've learned with working from home and that sort of thing, it's great to be able to have all our staff back in the office and for us to be able to see each other again.
And you, Stephen?
Yeah, probably like Adrienne. I think there was certainly a sense of accomplishment for the country last night around achieving, level 1. I think there's something that's pretty special globally, and I think it's a moment for a little bit of celebration, perhaps for New Zealanders too. From a work perspective, we're a highly distributed organisation. We've got people around the world, not just here in New Zealand, and actually whilst in New Zealand with level 1 occurring, people can begin to return to work, and we'll start to see that happen over the course of this week, and then next week we should be back to our standard routines. But internationally, of course, the situation's slightly different in different countries, and our teams are feeling quite different in different parts of the world right now as they watch New Zealand achieve this particular milestone. So as an organisation, life will return a bit more to normal on Monday from physical presence with each other. I think people are genuinely looking forward to spending a bit more time in proximity with their colleagues and not so much time on Zoom. But I think some of that behaviour is going to continue. I think we're going to see people making better choices about their work and home time and how they can use that time more effectively. Well, at least I hope so. Moving forward. But we should recognise that we've achieved a remarkable position as a country and being able to move around freely without the risk of further or significant risk of further community infection. It's pretty extraordinary place for us to find ourselves.
Stephen, it looks like you've still got a fair few empty desks there behind you. And Adrienne, I wanted to pick up on a point you mentioned, that everybody is actually really excited about getting back together, being able to have face-to-face interaction with their colleagues, with their staff. Do you think that is something that's going to happen quite quickly now we're in level 1, or do you think it is going to be a sort of a slow easing back into reality?
Well, perhaps I can go first. We've been monitoring people coming in and out of AT offices right through from the start of level 2. It was actually very slow and gradual. It was a bit slower than we thought, and as I said, we got to about 35–40% by yesterday. We do expect that by the start of next week, within normal kind of constraints, that we will be back to a normal load, which is not necessarily every last person back, but certainly a huge number. So, yes, things have changed.
Stephen, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, sure. I think, when we went to level 4, when we went to lockdown, of course, people took a lot of their equipment with them as well. So when as of last night, of course, leading teams know that they can begin to come back to work from today, and we're sort of a few more people coming today, but we've also said to people, look, take until Monday to be able to return equipment, materials, property, etc. Back into your office environment, because you probably need it here. So it'll take a few days for it to happen, but the feedback I've had from our staff has been very positive. People are generally pretty excited to get back inside and actually be based out of the office again. But as I mentioned before, I think we'll see some of those trends of better choice of different technologies and alternative options for working to stay into the future, I think.
And Jolie, I guess if any organisation is well placed to be able to have their staff working from home, it's Spark.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've had over 4,500 people working from home across this period. And so we've seen the full sort of range of collaboration tools and how that's worked. And I think now as we start to think about, or as we've moved to level 1 and more people may be able to come back into the office, it's really around what do we want to lock in from that period now as we look ahead. Some of the behaviour changes we saw during that time too, how do we make sure that we hold on to the things that worked really well and sort of, for all of us, perhaps in some ways gave us back some more time as well. When you stand back and think about how busy lives can be, how much movement we can have, how do we actually use the tools that we have now and a familiarity with using them and sort of more commonplace to actually get the benefits from it as we look ahead. So we're thinking hard as an organisation around what that range looks like within flexible working over the next period of time.
Stephen, with this move to level 1, we've heard again a lot of talk about this trans-Tasman bubble when in fact it is going to be an option, and also this concept of a Pacific bubble. Why are we not getting any firm plans around that? What are we waiting for?
Probably can't speak for the specifics behind the various ministers involved in either side of the Tasman, or indeed the points of view on different organisations like Ministry of Health on both sides of the Tasman with respect to the Australia Safe Travel Zone. But from what we see, there's a lot of complexity involved in agreeing something like this, such as, New Zealand and Australia agreed to have mutual exclusivity with each other around the free movement of people between the two countries. How does either country then move forward to opening borders with other countries, or in fact, the Pacific in the case of New Zealand, etc. So there's a lot of complexities around how you actually bring this to life. Now, and I know there's been a number of private sector organisations who have been working in collaboration with government. Some of that information you would have seen in the media as well, trying to come up with some various answers and solutions. And I suspect it's just a case of working through those in enough detail to have confidence. I suspect none of us really want to go back to level 4. And that's something that's weighing on the minds of the officials and, of course, the ministers who are having to make that call. And it's not just ours in New Zealand, right? I mean, a border is like a bridge between two places. There are two ends to it. There's the New Zealand end for sure, and then, of course, there's the other end of the bridge. And to enable movement across it, both ends have to be open. And so I think there's a fair bit of work to go, or a fair bit of water to go under the bridge in terms of figuring out the nuances of how we do that as a country to make sure that we don't lose the ground we've covered.
And just one more for you, Stephen, before we move on. There has been this talk about a concept of a smart border. Can you explain exactly what this is and how it might work?
Well, it's interesting. I was having a conversation this morning about the smart border, and 3 different people have 3 different opinions on exactly what that definition means. So it's probably one of those complex things that will evolve over time. But essentially it means that there's the use of technology, medical testing and tracing, or track and trace type capability pre-departure from your source market, during the transit through the air travel and so forth, and of course post-arrival in a destination, and using technology to ensure that we're able to determine what the appropriate level of risk is, where that risk might occur, how do we manage and mitigate that risk moving forward. So the idea is effectively using data and intelligence to ensure that we are protecting New Zealand and New Zealanders from any potential risk. But the reality with the smart border, of course, is that it's not just applicable to COVID. It could be used for many, many different types of circumstances, and obviously in the service of things like justice and customs and others. Because if we're able to use people movement and intelligence and data in that way, it does bring into question, I guess, what else we could do and how that could serve the interests of New Zealand in particular. So that's the basis behind it. So the smart border is really about using those sort of technologies to enable us to make those better choices and then find people if we need to in the event there's some kind of secondary or tertiary outbreak.
Adrienne, a question from you from a very smart group of Nelson College students. We all noticed and enjoyed considerably less traffic on our roads during lockdown. The students want to know if you're looking at introducing demand management, and can you explain what this is and how it might work?
Okay, where do I start with this? So there's an integrated transport system in Auckland, and so that means that when you're looking at demand, you've got to sort of look at what are you actually talking about. Are you looking at public transport, or are you looking at basically the really big issue that we're always trying to manage is the single occupancy vehicle going to work at peak. because that is one of the most inefficient uses of particularly our motorway system, which of course is not under the control of Auckland Transport. Do we look at demand management? Yes, the answer is we look at it very comprehensively. A lot of it is actually about incentives. So if you are giving choices and options so that people can make choices about not using a car at peak, as I said, that is where we have the most congestion and the most issues. So there are, and I could go into the way that we prioritise bus lanes, the way that we allow high occupancy cars into bus lanes, in some cases, which are called T2 or T3. The way that we provide a lot of public transport services in areas of highest demand. So people have got the real choice, the way that we look at providing a lot more cycleways so that, again, for shorter journeys, people have got the choice of protected cycleways, and that is the case in some parts of Auckland and will be increasingly. One of the really big issues that has been talked about for decades and is used in other countries, particularly to manage demand, again, of the single occupancy vehicle, is some kind of congestion charging or network charging. That's something that has been examined in the past by Auckland Council. It has been subject to some very big studies at government level, and it is sort of one of those areas of ongoing investigation. So those financial instruments I think are really important for the future, and I expect they'll come to the fore again in a year or two. So yes, demand management is a huge part of trying to actually spread the demand on the transport system, and that includes public transport as well as private vehicles.
Now, we are getting a lot of questions in from you all. Thank you so much for joining us, and we will try to get to as many of them as we can. A question now for Jolie, sticking with our theme today of connectivity and connecting New Zealand. There's been a lot of discussion around the importance of 5G and how it's never been more important for us to look at it. Can you explain what a 5G New Zealand could do that 4G can't?
I think if you think about the opportunity with 5G in terms of rolling that infrastructure, what it does bring, there's a few things. So low latency, which means the time between data being moved across network is very low. So you can do types of activities that perhaps you couldn't even consider before under 4G. If you think about the capacity, so what that means is it can carry a lot more across its network. We can also slice those networks, so we can guarantee a service, for example. So if you had, for example, a medical service or some other service that you needed to be absolutely certain that there would be no impact on that service, then you can actually slice that network. So there's some of the things it can do. It'll also help fuel a lot of the technology and innovation we're seeing around the Internet of Things, which is really around using, so an example where Adrienne's just talking about transport. So for example, smart cities and sensors to be able to connect cars. So I'm not talking about necessarily autonomous cars, but I'm talking about connected cars, traffic lights, to different infrastructure. For when we think about managing congestion around a city, that becomes a lot more possible if you have that really strong connectivity sitting behind it. And we know as each generation has come of mobile connectivity, we've been able to do more and more, and we're seeing the adoption of it be very fast. So I think for us, we look at the opportunities around that. And we've recently launched a fund, for example, it's called an Innovation Fund, which we're looking for great ideas around how this will help New Zealand recover and how it might help in the health space. So supporting small business to be able to think about some of those other areas that we might invest behind. So a bit of tech mentoring and a bit of funding to help support those small businesses within that fund.
Stephen, there's a lot of viewers interested in the regional impact of our borders being closed and what that means for tourism in the regions. How do we get regional New Zealand to look at adopting new approaches that are sustainable, agile, and support those communities?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I think
One of the great things about our regions in New Zealand is they're all quite unique, and in fact tourism has a distinctly different impact on each region of New Zealand in quite different ways. So we have some regions that are heavily dependent upon tourism, like Queenstown and Rotorua and the Tutakaka Coast, for example, and we have others who have significant significant tourism industries, but as a proportion of employment or GDP, they're actually considerably smaller, such as in Auckland or metropolitan areas like Christchurch or Wellington. So I think there's no one-size-fits-all solution to how we recover in that respect, or the role or opportunity around tourism. In terms of the sustainability question, though, I think that's slightly broader, and we think about sustainability being environmental and economic and social and community. So, if we're doing anything in tourism, certainly from a Tourism New Zealand point of view, we're trying to look at it through that lens. So it's like, we need to add, sometimes it's about putting less people but more value into one region, but it also might, in some other cases, might be the opposite. It might actually be about how do we add more volume into a particular location to make it sufficiently scalable and also sustainable economically and viably and so forth. So the considerations around how to make that work are actually quite complex. And we tend to work quite closely, increasingly closely, with regional tourism organisations, local government and community and EU and so forth, in terms of how we make sure we bridge those different components together. Short term, really, it's about collaboration. So, we're going to have significantly less visitors in the country in terms of international for some time, and it gives. But of course, we have quite a large New Zealand population, and from a tourism point of view, 58% of the tourism volume in New Zealand, of course, is Kiwis going on holiday. So, one of the opportunities for the tourism sector or regional New Zealand is how do they tap into the New Zealand psyche? How do they learn about what Kiwis really want and what they want to experience from New Zealand? And as part of that development and thinking, what does sustainability really look like? Is it a carbon neutral solution? Is it a waterways based challenge? Is it a community impact challenge in question? Is it about flora or fauna? So there's a number of different angles to consider and how we might want to, take account of sustainability in a broader sense. I could talk a lot about sustainability from an international markets point of view and from doing today that are going to play into our future as a nation, not just from a tourism point of view, but actually in terms of the quality of life of our residents, the impact on the planet, the impact it has on our native species, and of course the value of our export products, and whether it be technology or lamb or wine, is actually all linked into our reputation story as a country, and sustainability is going to play an increasingly important part of that.
Jolie, a question for you from Paul Minette. He's wanting to know if someone has surveyed, I guess, a more broader sort of national survey, business and workers, to find out exactly how viable work from home is, or are we just assuming that people are just going to carry on as they have for the past couple of months?
I think there are a number of surveys that I've already seen come across both LinkedIn and various other forums. We've done some ourselves to try and understand what our people are thinking about it. I do think we want to engage to understand and reflect. I think as we get more people back in the office, I think there's one thing for me is really certain. It shouldn't be the same as it was before, but we need to understand what are the real benefits and how do we best utilise those. And also be reflective of the fact that even if I think about my business, I have a range of different teams that sit within that. And so some of these things work better for some than they do for others. So how do we make sure that we reflect all of the types of work that we have, and then that the solutions or the things that are possible? So I think in terms of the question, should we be asking people's perspective? Absolutely, and that is happening across the board. I think collating some of those insights as we now come out into level one and we start to think about that would be really important to help influence people and how they think about what they want to do next within their own businesses.
Adrienne, a lot of questions about light rail and regional and passenger rail, and about how rail transport could be a way for us to save carbon. But the reality is most of our trips are still done in cars on roads. So what alternatives do we need to be looking at as ways to reduce our carbon emissions?
Well, there's a pretty harsh reality in terms of looking at decarbonising our economy, and particularly the impact from transport emissions, that there has actually been huge growth in vehicle kilometres travelled by fossil fuel burning motor vehicles over the last 10 years. And while we've had quite significant mode shift, and a lot of people have moved some of their journeys to public transport, in fact, carbon emissions are still going up. So one of the real things that I think is going to need to be gripped up, and this is really more of a government level policy change, is how do we electrify New Zealand's transport fleet? And that particularly goes to the private transport fleet. That is probably one of the most significant things that we do need to address, because while we will continue to really focus on a change of mode for those for whom it's realistic, and if you're a farmer or you're living a long way from a major population centre, you do have quite limited choices. But for those who are living in the Auckland urban area, then obviously giving lower carbon choices, and that includes things which are positive, such as walking and cycling, or low harm. But at the end of the day, we have to grip up the fact that there is a huge number of journeys are just basically still done and will be done for quite a long period into the future. The other issue that I talked about was pricing, and I think, again, once these much lower carbon targets are made real, we're going to need to start to look at those financial instruments and what they can achieve, to both look at reducing the amount of that kind of traffic, but also to incentivise the change of the fleet through to an electrified fleet.
Okay, question for you, Jolie, around education. Should schools be looking at staggering their start times to help with transport connectivity? And should our curriculum change to bring more digital skills to the fore?
Look, there are a number of questions within that one. If I stand back and think about education, though, I think what we have seen is the period through lockdown gave us a great opportunity to see how schools could work through that time. Clearly it was done in a very short period of time to lead into a way. And so as we look forward, we'd be thinking about how could we change, like we are in businesses or in organisations, how should we start to think about changing, whether it's the week, whether it's particular times of the day to reflect. And I know those conversations have gone on before in education too, as to, especially as you get into senior school, should children consider starting later, and that would create, I guess, less congestion, to the point of what Adrienne's been talking about. I think the reality that the tools and the skills that they need with those tools are increasingly becoming necessary as we look ahead and we think about the future of what we want for New Zealand. So there's no doubt in my mind that we need to be increasing that as part of the curriculum, because people need to be familiar with how to do that, so that when they start to leave or they move to tertiary education or other employment, they have those base skills with them. So for me, I think it should be something, and I guess that then goes to a question is, how do we skill the teachers as well to be able to do that and have that capability? And I think that's something, as we look ahead for New Zealand and we think about a plan for New Zealand, part of that should be, what is the pathway? And we've already seen schools this year are obviously shifting to more of a digital footprint, but I think there's opportunity for even greater focus on that.
Right, final question for both of you from Cameron Bradley. How do we ensure that short-term politics don't trump progress towards a long-term vision? Adrienne, maybe if you want to start with that.
Well, we've actually got some pretty fantastic tools already in our toolbox. If I just look at Auckland, we've got the Auckland plan. Now, while the Auckland plan does get renewed every 3 years, it's a really big document that's got some very big moves in it, which are broadly agreed across the political spectrum, and is the guiding plan for Auckland as far as local government and the CCOs go. And it involves a lot of public consultation, and it eventually, when these plans start to get into our everyday language, we don't even realise where those ideas have come from, but they're actually embedded in that plan. So things such as housing and equality, the impacts of urbanisation and the opportunities for Māori and Pacifica, transport and the environment, they're all really strong drives that are in the Auckland plan. And a lot of people kind of don't know where those ideas come from, but that's where they sit. So I do think that having great plans which are refreshed every so often and which really speak to the people and speak to the issues that we have in our areas are really important tools going forward. And they tend to be embraced by politicians because at the end of the day, politicians are voted in by the people of a particular area. So they need to reflect the vision and the issues of the people.
And for you, Jolie, I'll just repeat that question. How do we ensure short-term politics don't trump progress towards our long-term vision, and I guess especially relevant just months out from an election?
Yeah, just building on Adrienne's point there, I think for me, when I think about what we need to do, we need to see both private sector, we need to see individuals when leaning into the conversation with government. I think COVID's shined a light on a number of things, particularly inequality that we see, social inequality that's existing. So what's our role in being part of that solution? And I think if we just rely or step back and wait for somebody else to do that, things won't change. So we all have to take responsibility, and to Adrienne's point, obviously we all vote and we all have a perspective, but I think it's actually around having that vision, and then what role do we play in making sure that it is part of the conversations we're having regularly, the actions we take in our own organisations reflect that, and we're moving towards a common goal and recognising that it isn't just one group that will influence this. It is a combination of public and private sector that need to work together, particularly in relation with the community as well. So for me, I think that's what I hope and expect as we go into this next phase and we think about a recovery for New Zealand, which is critical to have that sort of modern and fair economy as we look forward.
Thank you so much to you, Stephen, Adrienne and Jolie. Some really fantastic and fascinating insights there. And thank you so much to all of you for joining us at home on Vision Week New Zealand.
Thank you.
Thank you for your questions, and thanks to Belinda Henley and our panellists. The way we move around to work and to relax is very much part of our lifestyle as New Zealanders. During lockdown, we experienced something very different. Belinda Henley asked technology entrepreneur Rod Drury about our high-tech opportunities and also what we've learned from everything coming to a stop.
Rod, what have we learnt over the last 2 months about how we move around?
Yeah, so what we've seen is that you don't actually have to drive to work to go to work. So, and that really ties into the lifestyle I think we value as New Zealanders. You know, we hate sitting in traffic, and I think we've shown that we don't need to. So getting that mix between working from home, where we use that fantastic ultra-fast broadband infrastructure that's been put in place over the last 10 years, and then balancing that with being at work at the right time, so you're having quality meetings with people and giving that sort of social connection where all that nuance happens. So I think we can be real leaders in this global working. And of course, because we're in a time zone which overlaps the US and Australia, having that time flexibility, if we're building export businesses, absolutely works.
You've been quite outspoken in the past on some of your big ideas for our transport sector. Has the past 2 months changed the way you view that at all?
Yeah, it's really interesting because we all like flying, but now we've seen the clean air by not flying. So I think one of the really big ideas is for us to lead in electric flight. One of the cool things about New Zealand is we are a long, skinny country, but we're an island. 100% of our domestic network is flying under 2 hours. You think if we had a vision in like a 10-year time frame where we had 100% of our domestic network flying using electricity, that would mean, you know, flights should be a whole lot cheaper if we can reduce the price of electricity, which is, you know, part of the renewable electric platform, but also we wouldn't have that carbon guilt. So I think that's really exciting, and everyone's seen what it looks like to have clear skies. So I think that's a goal that all of us in New Zealand can sign up for.
And obviously that doesn't just apply to air travel either.
Yeah, well, you know, I think over the last few years, most people have had experience with electric vehicles. That's really exciting. And, you know, most people have probably heard we're doing some amazing autonomous flight trials down in the South Island at the moment. And there's a great opportunity for us as we think about public transport, working with some of those global companies, bringing them back here, using New Zealand as an R&D lab to test autonomous driving, and we're actively working on a few of those projects now.
The fact that so many of us, as you say, are now working from home and have figured out that we can work from home, what impact do you think that is going to have on transport and public transport offerings?
Yeah, it's really interesting. At the moment, public transport is geared around, you know, a really big peak, getting everyone to work and home at the same time. So if you start to, you know, spread that load out again, you flatten the curve of transport even, then you can have, you know, we don't need to have as much infrastructure in place, which is really interesting. If you think about it, you know, every commuter has one of these things. We know what their normal traffic patterns are. We know what the weather's going to be like next Tuesday, so you can imagine building smart networks that tie into public transport as well. And the idea of having autonomous electric vehicles, you know, small buses that you can chain together with software is really, really interesting. And it's been fun over the last month getting to know some of these new companies. You're just getting to a threshold where technology is making that quite possible. So certainly in the next 5 to 10 years, all of that, you know, the way that we've thought about public transport in the past really changes now, because we've got such more fine-grained control of really cool, clean, small vehicles that are super cheap.
In tomorrow's program, we'll look at environment, water and energy. Tune in to Sustaining New Zealand tomorrow at 10:30. We'll have another expert panel at 11 and the opportunity for you to have your questions answered live after the discussion. But for now, that is all from me. We'll leave you with a look at what's coming up in tomorrow's program. Kia pai tōra. Our very own rocket man, Peter Beck there, talking to Belinda Henley. And if you want to watch anything again, longer versions of all our interviews will be made available on our website. Vision Week continues tomorrow at 10:30, where I'll again join you from the Royal New Zealand Yacht Squadron. We'll be talking about connecting New Zealand, the transport, technology and tourism that's so vitally important in our homes and communities, our work, and in our defence of the America's Cup next March. Remember that you can send in your vision for New Zealand or ask questions of our panellists in our live Q&A sessions. Until I see you again tomorrow at 10:30, ngā mihi nui, hei kona.
Once you can observe what is the living system of nature and the role that everything plays in it, whether it's moss or rock or worm or human, then we can see the everlasting way to go.
What are we doing about how do we really create environmentally resilient infrastructure in the future?
I think that there is an opportunity for New Zealand specifically to live up to the promise that we have spent the last several decades making to the world.
And for me, one of the things that's come out of this shutdown and out of this crisis is the fact that if we fall back on those values that New Zealand's always held, which is it being at the forefront of many different things in the world, whether it's refrigeration and our ability to export from the bottom of the world, whether it's about women's suffrage, whether it's about, you know, our very progressive social policies in the 1930s and 40s, we've always been leaders. And I think that our vision should be about us being the best that New Zealand can be, because we will be, I believe, a beacon for the world in a time of quite huge challenge, in fact.
Technology is getting to a point where you can imagine us, you know, flying domestically using electricity in a 10-year time frame. So the time to have that discussion is absolutely now.
For all investment decisions going forward, whether they're made by central or local government, by public-private sector, These investments now need to all be looked at through a climate change lens.